Welcome to this explainer. What if the relentless march of technological advancement isn't just about giving us faster computers and smarter machines? What if the very fabric of human invention is actually the exact mechanism paving the way for females to lead our global society? It's a bold, sweeping premise, right? Well, that is the exact argument laid out in the fascinating historical and sociological text we're diving into today. The author proposes a really compelling theory. From the invention of the basic shovel all the way to the rise of artificial intelligence, human destiny, and specifically the balance of gender power, has been entirely dictated by our tools. To really unpack this argument, we're going to follow the author's exact chronological timeline. So, we'll start with technology and early labor, move into the industrial era shift, explore information age equalization, break down the economics of empowerment, and finally look at what this all means for the age of AI. Okay, let's jump right into part 1, technology and early labor, the foundation of history. The author anchors their entire thesis on a highly structured chronological timeline. Human history isn't just some random series of events, right? It's a progression dictated by specific technological epochs. We move from the hunter and gatherer stage into the agricultural, through the industrial, into information, and finally landing right where we are now in the age of AI. And according to the text, the social dynamics of every single one of these eras are defined by the tools available at the time.
So, what did those early tools actually require from us? Well, muscle, brute force. The author argues that early male dominance in society was not some innate, preordained human condition. Not at all. Rather, it was simply a byproduct of the intense physical labor required during the hunting, gathering, and early agricultural stages. Because the work was so incredibly physical, it naturally created a male-dominated labor force. And whoever dominates the labor force, the author notes, basically ends up dominating the society. It was quite literally a matter of biomechanics, not destiny.
Moving on to Section 2, the Industrial Era Shift, where we see the first cracks in that system. The text highlights a really crucial historical turning point to illustrate this shift, specifically focusing on the United States during World War II. The author notes that as males were sent overseas to fight fascism, females stepped right onto the factory floors. And those industrial machines? They proved to be a massive equalizer. Females were relied upon to perform hard factory tasks, and they did it incredibly successfully. The machines meant that brute physical strength was just no longer the sole prerequisite for heavy industrial output.
However, that progress was temporarily halted. The author points out a massive post-war regression. Basically, when the war ended, females were largely pushed out of the factories and shoved back into domestic roles, a dynamic the author vividly describes as being forced back to being barefoot and pregnant. This massive return to domesticity actually resulted in the huge population spike we now know as the baby boomers. And a fun fact from the text, that demographic term was actually coined by the economist and demographer Richard Easterlin.
All right, let's get into Section 3, the information age and leveling the playing field.
What is super fascinating about this era is how the two genders adapted to early computers. The text cites a 1994 observation from Shafi, noting that as massive early computers like the IBM 7990 entered the workspace, things really started to level out. But there was a stark difference in approach here. The source argues that females excelled as information technology advanced because they intuitively utilized the tech as a practical tool for productivity. On the flip side, the text claims males often viewed the advancing technology merely as a toy.
Early on, male executives were completely dismissive. The author points out that while females were doing the vast majority of the actual computer work in offices, male executives just minimized it, calling early word processing mere secretarial work. But the tech kept evolving into what the text calls the convergence substage. Once voice, data, and video converged into devices that literally fit in the palm of your hand, well, the game was over. The text states unequivocally that females proved to be absolute equals to males in utilizing these modern tools of production.
But hold on. This brings us to a glaring contradiction in the real world. Think about it. If the tools of production are finally equal, and if educational attainment is equal, why on earth does wage disparity continue today? The author argues that despite females demanding equal participation in wages at higher levels of education, deeply entrenched, male-dominated societies still actively force females into inferior positions. Basically, the tech has evolved, but our social structures are seriously lagging behind.
Which brings us to Section 4, economic empowerment, exploring its impact and prosperity.
The author takes a step back here to outline the incredibly foundational roles females naturally hold in society. They are, quite literally, the producers of the future labor force itself. The text identifies them as humanity's first teachers, our first nurses, and our first spiritual guides. The crucial takeaway here is that a male-dominated economy that sidelines females is blinding itself. It is inherently missing out on a massive portion of its own productive and foundational resources.
For an economy to fully prosper, the source argues, it has to clearly and enthusiastically embrace female empowerment and equality, and they bring the real-world receipts for this. The author points to studies from World Bank economists analyzing microloans in places like Bangladesh and Africa. When financial power, even just in the form of small microloans, was put directly into the hands of females, both output and overall productivity demonstrably increased. Bottom line, empowerment equals economic prosperity.
Taking this economic data, the author draws a very hard line. They make the specific claim that economies which restrict full female participation in the labor force are essentially doomed to stay in poverty. It's not just a moral failing in their eyes, it's a sheer economic death sentence. In making this stark point, the text specifically calls out Islamic countries as examples of economies suffering due to these restrictive labor practices.
Yet, even with the clear economic benefits of equality staring us in the face, severe systemic barriers remain. The author lists several grim realities that persist even in advanced economies. Male chauvinism and misogynistic attitudes continue to thrive. Tragically, this is evidenced by human trafficking, spousal abuse, and the victimization of females through prostitution, industries where males are the dominating customers. On top of that, the text notes that religious views, deeply held cultural traditions, and a lack of equal access to educational opportunities continue to act as massive impediments to progress.
Now, right before we move to the final stage of our technological timeline, the author includes this fascinating sign-off note at the very end of their essay that completely reframes their sweeping cultural critiques. They write, "By the way, I am a male born in an Islamic country." It's a totally surprising piece of context that adds a deeply personal layer of observation and urgency to their arguments about systemic oppression and the dire economic consequences of restricting female empowerment.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, the age of AI and the future of labor.
As we move headfirst into an era dominated by artificial intelligence, the very nature of work is fundamentally changing. The author argues that work in the AI stage absolutely must be collaborative, inclusive, and compassionate. And because of this massive shift away from brute physical labor and isolated tasks, females have way more to offer the labor force than ever before in human history. They are uniquely positioned with the exact traits required to thrive alongside AI.
Which brings us to the source material's ultimate resounding conclusion. Female empowerment is no longer just an issue of fairness or, even just economic prosperity. According to the text, in this new technological epoch, the very fate of humanity clearly rests on our ability to fully embrace female empowerment. The AI revolution makes it an absolute necessity for societal survival.
Think about it. The tools of production have evolved from the shovel to the steam engine to the smartphone and now to artificial intelligence. At every single step, the requirement for physical dominance is faded, making way for a totally new paradigm. The data shows empowerment leads to prosperity, and the technology of tomorrow straight up demands collaboration and compassion. So the final question you have to ask yourself as we wrap up this explainer is this: is humanity finally ready to let go of outdated male-dominated structures and truly embrace this ultimate technological and societal shift? Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep questioning the world around you.